We are live right now.
Wonderful. So, welcome. Let me do a little bit of a brief introduction. I'm Ehsan Garajadaki. I go by Dr. G. I'm clinical psychologist and chairman of the board and clinical director at Norus Clinic Foundation. So, basically, what I do for a living is mental health. Now, this session is about mental health and treatment. It's going to be an interesting ride today. Let me first of all ask you, how many of you came here to hear about meditation, relaxation, and yoga? Not that many. Wonderful. I love it. Fantastic. Yes, that's being oversold, isn't it? Right, in the mental health area. And we are told, do that, relax, take a deep breath, and do yoga. That is what takes care of, or go to therapy. But not many people actually make it, right? Not many people seriously go there. So today, I want to take us a little bit further, actually deeper into the depth of mental health and what each and every one of you can actually do about it. Let's start with something less serious but more meaningful. Einstein, as most of you have heard of him and know about him, was once asked, what's the most important question in the world? What's the most important question that human beings, ask themselves on a daily basis? And he answered, is the world a safe place? That's what every one of us want to find out. That's what we grapple with every single day. Is the world safe? And I want to take it even further. That was about 100 years ago, 120 something years ago, when Einstein was asked that. And the extension of that question is actually, is the world a better place? And aligned with very much the spirit of IYC and what everybody is gathered here online or in person, I'm sure you're asking yourself that question too. And how can it be a better place? You're here as young entrepreneurs in your communities to really answer that question, but also go beyond that question, not just answering it, but making it happen. Now, this question is interesting, right? Is the world a better place? If you think about it, especially nowadays, with the youth, especially the young population around the world, struggling the most in the history of humankind. They have the most level of stress recorded ever, if you think about it. And the opportunities and resources they have are dwindling. The youth of today has a disproportionate amount of stress versus the opportunities that they have. For instance, they hardly can afford a home nowadays just by themselves. They hardly can live a one earner family anymore. It used to be the standard one earner, right, in families. People used to have many, many children, but again, today, hardly any youth can think of having multiple children. They probably have to settle down to one child in the future. Now, interestingly, juxtapose it against what also we have in the world, which is the least amount of warfare and barbarism throughout the history, the most amount of medical and technological advancements in this world that we all are enjoying. On top of that, the most amount of support, community work, and intercultural connection that exists in communication in this world. Despite all those advancements, the youth of today has to actually struggle most compared to other generations. If we think about it, how come? To me, it sounds like Groundhog Day. We repetitively find ourselves, generation after generation, asking ourselves that question, how can the world be a better place? Why do we struggle so much despite thousands of years of history, of civilization? We are not really doing better in that particular regard. in the area of stress management, overcoming those kind of paradoxical, repetitive, I would say, shackles that imprison us. And that is something that every youth really has to come to answer and figure out. Now, let me share with you about that question, how I answered that question. For the past 30 years, really, I too, was struggling with the same question. Is the world a better place? How can it become a better place? And I was searching, I was just going around myself, reaching out into activism, changing the system, changing this, changing that, going all around myself until I figured out one very, very important distinction. Rather than asking ourselves, is the world a better place? What happened for me, which helped me change my whole life and literally be able to get a grip on everything in my life, was a different question. The question was, am I in a better place? You see, the difference, once I got it, was an internal focus of organization, which is under our control. If you ask that question, am I in a better place? You tap into a whole world of resources that are at your fingertips. You can live your life 30, 40, 50 years of advocacy trying to change the world. You cannot achieve that unless you start with changing the internal world. Let me share also with you something that you probably will face in a few years when you're kind of my age. We all, people, the old people, we were at your place one time. All the people who you think are part of the problem, they were youth at one time. They were young people. They were in your position trying to change the world. So what's the difference really between these generations? What I can share with you is the most distinct difference between really ages and generations is that when you get older, you are capable of doing something that you were not able to do early on, which is called self-regulation. You see, for young people, emotions, they're kind of on equal level. All kinds of emotions have the same value. You get angry, you get happy, you get joyful, you get disappointed. They have equal value. That's no problem. Because you have to go through that experiment. But what we gain with age is basically an organization, a roadmap, a plan. What emotions are appropriate at what time? What emotions and what can I do with these emotions and feelings? And then bring them under my control and channel them in the right direction. That's really what we gain. An example I can give you is if you don't, figure out that formula. Most recently, in one of the cases that I had to handle, Adam, I call him Adam and Eve, just, for anonymously, so to say, one of the clients, 19-year-old young person who went to military and is at home dealing with a lot of family issues. Mother living with stepdad for 6 years, and they have marital issues. He overheard, Adam, the 19-year-old, overheard a spat between the parents and really, really got upset and couldn't hold his anger anymore. Empathizing with his mom's pain going through the abusive relationship, seemingly abusive relationship. He grabs the stepfather, takes him to the ground, wants to fight him, tells him, come on, step up and be a man, hit me and fight with me. One thing he doesn't realize is that emotional reaction in the moment can determine the next 20, 30 years of his life. You see, when you look around and see people who, for instance, made it, so to say, or in power positions, they didn't get over there overnight. It's not the decision they made yesterday or last week or last year that got them into there. It's a decision they made 20, 30 years ago that put them on a certain trajectory that ultimately got them there today where they are. That is going back to that ability of self-regulation. I want to go even beyond that, from self-regulation to self-liberation. If you want to finally figure out how, maybe for the first time in the human history, to be able to overcome that paradoxical formula that has a grip on you, where you wouldn't ask yourself down the road, how come the world hasn't changed? How come the worldwide peace hasn't been created? But you actually want to live that life. You want to accelerate this self-liberation beyond what everybody is going through, at the grip of their feelings and emotions. Let me share with you how we actually can do that, a journey to self-liberation. I'm going to share with you an example that happened. On the plane here, there were a couple of passengers behind me. They were chatting this and that. And once we were getting off, one person turned to the other and said, "Hey, it was very nice meeting you. We were meant to meet. We were meant to be together to learn about each other." That's an interesting thing. And this is a universal, it exists in all cultures where people, from a chance encounter, they cannot handle it. They cannot handle the anxiety that comes up with getting to know an unknown person, a stranger. So what they have to do is they have to infuse meaning into something that actually doesn't have any predetermined meaning. Life, everything is a coincidence. Everything just happens naturally, but we have a hard time, interestingly, finding meaning into that. It's kind of meaningless, so to say, in regards to a predetermined meaning, but our mind has a very, very hard time with that. Why is that? There is really the concept of self-deception. I have to share that with you. That self-deception, like our thought, the deception of thought. Our thoughts are fooling us in certain terms. Let me share with you how that helps, how that works. About 120 years ago, somebody called Krishnamurti, Jiddu Krishnamurti, came up with this idea of what the person I would regard as actual psychologist, a real psychologist. He didn't regard himself as that. And this was corroborated by a quantum physicist called David Bohm 20, 30 years after that. If you guys are interested in that, you can go to kfa.org, Krishnamurti Foundation America, and David Bohm Society, learn more about it. And they brought this idea of what we call the observer observed, and you all are familiar with it. You see, you can observe yourself at the same time you are being observed. So what our thinking, or what metacognition does, fools us into believing there is a distinction. There's a separation within us between the observer and the one being observed. That's the ultimate deception of thought. On top of that, there is a second deception happening, which basically convinces us that we are higher than anybody else as far as, let's say, physiological organism. We are convinced that we are better than physiological, biological organism. Why? Because mostly we may think, being on the same level as any physiological organism, animals, plants, etc., that's kind of beneath us, below us, we're convinced to know there must be a different reason. There is a different state that we come from or we belong to, spiritual state, mental state, etc. That's also a little bit of a deception. I'll share with you why. Because everything that is really happening has a physiological underpinning. Emotions and feelings, when we are talking about that, is actual neurobiology, both body-mind connection that make that happen, but none of us are aware of those processes that are happening. When something like this, the anxiety I mentioned to you, that person who met each other said there is no coincidence, we were meant to meet here for whatever higher purpose. What is happening inside is that meeting a stranger triggers a little bit of an anxiety inside of us. That's a physiological phenomenon. We can handle it two ways. One is we can calm ourselves down, say, no, everything is going to be fine. I can handle it. I can interact with this person and we will figure it out, being in the moment. But most people haven't trained themselves to that level. So what happens is that kind of initial anxiety has to be reduced. That initial, what I mentioned to you, the deception of thought comes in to rescue, says, you know what? There must be a predetermined reason why you are saving this person or seeing this person. It's interesting, it's much easier for our mind, right, to conjure up a fantasy, an idea to calm ourselves down instead of actually doing it ourselves intentionally. That's really the reason this idea of meaningfulness comes in. Isn't that amazing? Now, let me share something else with you. There is a third component here. When you feel good, what happens in your mind and body, hormones are released, and there is your brain, according to what we call the dopaminergic reward system, that kicks in place a absolute, kind of rule that everything is fine, everything is okay. Whatever made it happen, I'm going to pursue that. It's at the core of everything we see in terms of, to some extent, addiction, what I would say, even from good, constructive to destructive ones. Constructive, for instance, of workaholism, everybody being busy, 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 that's what drives us. We get the dopamines, we continue. Destructive one, let's say alcoholism, right? Same principles. But our mind totally takes over due to one evolutionary reason, and that is it is the most efficient way to do things. So that's why your mind goes toward meaning making. If I can believe that there was a reason I met this person, I can relax. I don't have to deal with the strangeness. I don't have to deal with anxiety. I don't have to think through this thing. I don't have to plan what's the next plan. How do I, connect with this person? How are we going to continue? Blah, blah, blah. None of that, because my mind convinces myself, we don't need to do that. The most efficient way of dealing with this anxiety is just believe there was a predetermined reason you met this person. Isn't that amazing? It's unbelievably powerful biological processes that happen within us that take over. Now, what happens is if we can actually get a grip on this internally, instead of shifting into these, concepts, fantasies, ideas, then something powerful takes over. We notice that internally we can be invincible in any situation, even during trauma. Nowadays, a lot of people go to therapy for what? A lot of stress, traumatic events, and so forth. Let me share something with you about trauma. That's a very, very interesting fact. Across the world, especially in industrialized countries, 50%, 30 to 50% are exposed to trauma. Even in good countries, good neighbors, regions, peaceful regions, 50%, up to 50% on average are exposed to trauma. In war-torn countries, a lot of countries with famine and poverty, etc., up to 85, 90% are exposed to daily trauma. Now, this is an interesting fact. Only 8% of people exposed to trauma actually develop PTSD. 92% of people do not develop that due to internal stuff. They already own some anti-trauma mechanisms. That's what part of their neurobiology. So let me share with you what those are. Interestingly, what we know in terms of when people go through trauma, there are three phases that are of interest. What comes before trauma, what happens during the trauma, and what comes after. What comes before trauma is about predisposition, okay? The resources people have. That can be the genetic component, it can be education, training, past history, resilience, and so forth that they have had. What happens during the trauma, it's all about perspective. What kind of a perspective people take while they're going through that trauma. And what happens after trauma, it's all about support. What kind of a support they are receiving. Guess which one is the most fundamental? Any guesses from these? Resources you have, perspective you take, and the support that you get. Second, perspective. The most important part of people who have survived trauma and have come out victoriously and empowered, stronger, is the way they looked at the situation in regards to their own participation. If they looked at it in a way where they felt participant rather than a victim, if they felt, you know what, I'm part of this, I'm going to figure it out, I'm going to find a way out, this is not going to take me down, right? That participatory focus and perspective versus things are happening to me, I'm helpless, it's hopeless, I cannot do anything in this situation. That's the perspective. Now, support is secondary, and then the resources are what we come with. We cannot go back and change those resources, right? It's whatever you have or you don't have. Now, interestingly, taking this further, there is a very, very important element here where what I would like to get your attention to is that process of how to shift from empowerment, from victimization to empowerment. How can we establish that? There's the third deception of thought I'm going to share with you. And it's a super interesting thing. We get a little bit of a sip of water. You know, what's happening is, interestingly, our mind, our thoughts, and mostly thoughts, but sometimes also about emotions, they lack something called proprioception. Don't know how many of you guys are aware of that. What is proprioception? Proprioception is our ability to know more or less our body's location. It's the GPS of our body. To give you an example, any one of you can easily reach behind your head, right, your neck, and scratch your back. Scratch it 1 millimeter, you know exactly how to reach that. Or you sleep and you wake up, you're going to turn off the light, on light, etc. You can easily reach without even looking. You can bend down, calisthenics or athletic endeavors, moving even. You can turn, you can exactly know the angle of your body. There is a cause and effect, felt, tangible cause and effect between physiological movements and body regions. We lack that in our thoughts. If I ask you where in your head do you sense your thought, you cannot point to it, right? You don't know that your thought comes from you. The feeling and emotion that is created in you, who did that? You are doing that. But the problem is you cannot feel it, you cannot sense it. So what do people do? They attribute the source of their thinking, of their beliefs, of their feelings to outside factors. They convince themselves, I have to do this because this is happening outside. I'm feeling this way because this person behaved in that shape and format. Because there's no cause and effect relationship that is felt internally. Let me give you an example. A guy, activist, goes and wants to join a party and says, hey, I believe in this guy, I want to follow this person, blah, 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 writes a letter, wants to join the committee, is rejected. Goes back and says, you see, I knew it. All these people are unfair. This politician is corrupt. They didn't let me into this party. I know all along that they were corrupt. I'm going to join the other party, even though I don't necessarily wholeheartedly believe in this other party. I'm going to go join that party. Their followers asking him, how come? How come you're changing your mind, your values? You're kind of stepping over your values. Like he turns and says, you see, they don't leave me any choice. They didn't let me into this party. I have no choice but going into this other party. They completely overlook the internal cause and effect that is happening in their own mind. The choice that they're making, they call it, no, that's not a choice. That's not a decision. I had to. In French, we call that bullshit. Maybe there's a little bit of a different accent to it, bullshit. But no, jokes aside, this is at the core of that victimization, self victimization. How many times do we conjure up these ideas that, it's this person's fault, that person's fault. This person did this, therefore I have to do this. And we overlook that internal decision making that actually is taking place. That comes from that third deception of thought because we don't have that proprioception. Now, ultimately, bringing this all together, this idea of shifting away from self victimization into self empowerment goes something like this. People have to, believe it or not, what I would say, take a religious perspective. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about typical traditional religions. You see, religions are all good, no problem. I don't have anything against religions. But when I say religious perspective, I mean it literally. In Latin, religion comes from the word religio, which means I commit, I'm dedicated, I dedicate myself. We as human beings, we don't generally dedicate ourselves to that true understanding of human behavior, how these deceptions of thoughts keep distracting us because we have not learned how to do self regulation and self liberation. Due to that aspect, we continue repeating the same problems, the same ways of dealing with things around us, just like our parents and their forefathers and other generations have done before us. So finally, we have to come to this point of taking charge of that internal dynamics. And if you do, what happens is you would notice something else. What we have to do is take this God-given power that you guys have and engage it in that second component I mentioned to you, what comes after trauma, which is that support system, which we call social engagement. When you take full responsibility for everything that's happening in you, the way you're describing and interpreting the world, and connect it to your own decision making internally, and pull up your sleeves and say, you know what, these concepts that really don't exist, such as meaningfulness, or even, for instance, we talk about equality. Equality doesn't exist in the world. No thing is equal to another thing. In fact, that is contrary to diversity. Think about it. Diversity means that every human being is unique. Everything in this world is unique. You have to respect that uniqueness rather than thinking that equality exists by definition. It doesn't exist by definition, however, as just very much like meaning doesn't exist by definition, which is very important. Because if we believe in something that doesn't exist, is like following a mirage. When you follow a mirage, you never achieve it. It's always getting away from you. And the second problem with it is you're waiting for others to bring that thing to you because you think it exists somewhere, but you don't have it. If you come to truly understand that, see that, what happens is you snap out of that waiting mode for somebody to bring it to you. You pull up the sleeves and say, no, I am responsible. I want to get to a better place. I'm not going to wait for the world to get to a better place. I'm not going to wait for others to change the world and do things for me. I'm going to do that, and I'm going to do that together with others through social engagement. Now, another last part of neurobiology that is going to be very helpful for you, research that comes out of trauma talks about something called the polyvagal system, polyvagal social engagement system. And that is simply our neurobiology responding biologically to your engagement with another human being. That's what therapy works. When you sit in front of another person and say, how are you doing? Or let me tell you about how I'm doing. It's not the words that are doing the work. It's your neurobiology, is the vagus nerve that is controlling everything in your body, the vocal cord, the inner ear, your attention, your eyes, your focus. And one more thing that is extremely important to overcoming stress and trauma is what Dan Siegel calls a reintegration of fragmented areas of our brain. When we go through trauma and stress, the survival instinct takes over, which forces people and our mind to kind of fragment, specialize, because at any given moment, only one or two areas of our brain that are specialized to respond can respond in a fraction of a second. Problem with it is that it freezes in time. Okay, it freezes in time, and basically our mind kind of gets fragmented, disintegrated into different pieces, you know, uh, theoretically, let's say speaking, rhetorically. However, we feel the aftermath of the trauma in literally falling apart, having fallen apart, being into all kinds of different, in a disarray, multiple different disconnected, areas of our mind, of our psyche. So what happens through social engagement, the polyvagal system kicks in and strengthens the corpus callosum, the bridge between right brain and left brain. It strengthens the harmonization of these different parts of our brain. It's doing it without us knowing. This is a resource we all have. But what keeps us from that social engagement with other people? Very much in the belief in this construct, made up construct that keep us separate. Our biases, right? Our assumptions, they keep us separate. Our projection that this person looks different than me, therefore they must be dangerous. Okay? This person speaks different than me, therefore I cannot trust them. And if anything, I have to bring a higher power to believe, to convince me that this was meant to be, instead of working hard on actually making that relationship work. That hard work ultimately comes down to what we call effective dialogue. But nowadays, like millennia, people unfortunately do not engage in dialogue. What they engage in is constant debate and argument. They come from a point of pain and fear. They want to tell the other party, let me tell you how hurt I am, how badly in pain I am. And you better accept it, you better listen to me. Now, most people do that together with each other. What happens is we have a lot of talkers debating and arguing stuff with each other, and they are not taking the time actually doing the opposite, which is let me listen, find out what is going on for you. Where do you come from? What is your world like? Let me understand where you come from. That social engagement is the answer, has a natural healing effect. And on top of what we shared with you, the self-empowerment can move mountains. And it can literally finally give the youth of today the secret key to that success, that elusive success that every generation is looking for over and over again, how to create a better world around us. Thank you, guys.
If we have a few minutes, if you'd be open to maybe some questions, if there's any questions.
Yes.
Thank you so much for such a very inspirational speech. So I was thinking from, we were saying earlier, the perspective. So if you just were to switch the perspective, then you would have that effective dialogue, correct?
That's right.
Okay.
Yes. So changing the perspective of self-victimization to self-empowerment, right? Rather than believing that things happen to you, you've got to wake up that you are making it happen. You are a participant. Very, very briefly, I do a lot of couple therapy. When I work with the couples, I tell them you are both 50% accountable for everything that is happens. 50-50. There is not 51-49. Most people don't want to believe that. They want to say, no, I'm the good person. I only have 10% of responsibility for the bad things that are happening and 90% for all the good things. Right? That's a myth. So changing that, taking full responsibility for being a contributor to all the good things that are happening in the world and all the bad things that are happening in the world. We are all a contributor to both. It's hard to balance these two things in our mind, but that's a start. Yes.
So then what do you say to someone who has a poor perspective, but also has a situation that is truly out of their control? Like, for example, let's say they have an abusive partner, or they, let's say, God forbid, there's a natural disaster, or man-made disaster, or COVID, another good example, right? How do you change that person's perspective?
Yes, very good. So there are different states when we find ourselves in. And according to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, most people are familiar with that. When you are in a mode, when you're in a flood, you're losing everything, your mind, naturally shifts into that survival mode. So you just gotta have to trust that instinct. If you are truly in a situation where you have absolutely no control, and even in the flood, I have some control, right? Where do I swim to? Do I hang on to something that can pull me out of the flood or not? If you don't, you already drown. Bottom line, the sad truth is, if we absolutely have 0% chance, you're already gone. So what are you worrying about? But if I have 1% chance, I got to better figure it out. What's 1%? 1%. I'm in an abusive relationship. My partner is beating me. What is my percent? 1% that gives me a chance to get out. Can I talk to a trusted party? Can I keep spare keys somewhere? Can I write down a phone number to a trusted person that I could call somewhere? Can I memorize a phone number to a trusted person? I can. Nobody knows about how I'm memorizing stuff. Even my abuser doesn't know. Elizabeth Smart was a lady who was abused for many, many years, had kidnapped, I don't know, 10, 15, 12 years, whatever it was. She got out. And in her story, she was writing about how she was constantly looking for a way out. It took whatever years, but she got out, right? Focus on the 1% chance that you have. That's more than you need, instead of the 99% chance you don't have. Yes.
I thought it was really interesting how you talked about how when people have anxiety, they look to find a deeper meaning to like make up for that anxiety.
Yeah.
And for looking for a higher power for excuses in general. I feel like most people have a general anxiety just about the unknown or about the world in general. So do you think that's the reason why, this is more of a personal thing, do you think that that's the reason why people believe in God as a higher power?
One of the reasons, right? There are many, many reasons why people believe in God. But yes, one of the reasons, since in fact, if you guys are familiar with what we call Alcoholic Anonymous, if not, that's like a large group of people who suffer from alcoholism, has existed for almost 100 years. And when it was founded, the founder of that group recognized that one of the members has a particular hard time with kind of leaning on the support of the group to get better. He actually wrote to a famous psychiatrist called Carl Jung and to consult. It's like, what is one way that I can help this person and people like him who constantly fail? They try to do the right thing, but they constantly fail. Carl Jung basically wrote back and mentioned that there's one of the best ways to do is rely on a higher power. That's actually the origin of kind of the religious aspect, if you will, or spiritual aspect of what we call the 12 steps. where if you are in a situation where you no longer can rely on your own internal resources, there's a powerful moment. It's like a transformative experience to rely on a higher power. Now, one of the reasons is that why people believe in the religion. There are many, many different reasons. But going back to, I believe, the utilization of that is very important. If we don't take any actions, we're waiting and waiting and waiting for God to change our lives, it's not going to happen, right? But if we are doing our best and we are getting through these nooks and crannies of life and we get stuck somewhere and we reach out to a higher power and say, our consciousness conjures up a connection to something greater than us and says, please pull me through this. I just need to take one more step. Nothing wrong with that. Gives us energy, right? Thank you for the question.
Question back just a
Go
second.
ahead.
So, you talked about personal trauma, but like my question is, I think like nations also have traumas, right? Like national trauma. And if the country is victimized, then someone can take advantage of that. So like my question is, how do you heal and empower the entire nation? Which is like really hard.
Yes, that's right. Well, there's always different strategies in life. You could take kind of stock in the fact that if we can activate and mobilize that aspect of what we would call a common ground. So when we say nation, a nation comes around, around that core common ground, identity, right? If we can activate and mobilize that for good causes, not bad ones, right? It works. It's just how group psychology works. So knowing human behavior and human functioning, there's nothing bad in that. If a nation is being, for instance, is under yoke, is being attacked by another nation, so you mobilize that. You get the people around something common to them. Sometimes it's religion, sometimes it's rational identity, sometimes it is, for instance, natural disaster and all their homes have been destroyed. They want to come together and rebuild the community. There's a common cause, commonality between them. So the idea would be to mobilize them along those lines. Now, unfortunately, bad things are happening with using the same strategy, right? We have seen it over. And so it is in the kind of what we say, the proof is in the pudding. What are we achieving in the moment? Are we achieving something that serves the people that are involved in both short term, mid term, and long term? Or no, it actually hurts more people than a few. I hope that answered your question.
I kind of want to make a comment to your question, and I think that's why nonprofits and NGOs are so important. The ones that are doing good in that specific country, I think that's really important to rely on that. I think that gets people together to really do good and to motivate our country.
Wonderful. Yes.
Like you said earlier, with taking responsibility, like two people have responsibility for one action. Where do you think is like the limit as to where like you normally forgive or say sorry, but where do you think is the limit where people should just let go of something? Because if we always try to take responsibility or forgive, wouldn't that be detrimental to
Right.
you or the other person?
Wonderful. Yeah. So this is a very, very good question. And I know we only have like 2 minutes or less than that to answer that. So we take that as a last question because that's deep, honestly. And there's a case I have that currently I deal with that. Because, if you lose sight of the extent of it, you can go way too far and then convince yourself again that rationalization that our mind does, that we are in the right. I'm not a quitter. I have to go through at all costs and so forth. So basically, what we really need is evidence. We are many times we are kind of relying heavily on evidence that is conjured up internally, like what our mind is telling us, versus double checking that. So a lot of times through feedback informed, kind of auditing. So that's why, again, that social engagement, reaching out to more or less neutral parties, right? If I'm involved in something and reach to my brother who has my back, that's not a neutral party. I can get some information, but I also should strive to reach out to some other people who are trustworthy but neutral. Somebody who doesn't have a stake in the game, right? And get feedback. Like, hey, this is how I'm going about this. What do you think? I want to take responsibility, but also don't want to go too far. That's why we have therapists or counselors or consultants, right? To just keep ourselves as objective as possible. Okay, absolutely.
That's unfortunate our time. Thank you.
Yes.
Please help us thank Dr. Lee.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben.